Thanks for listening to this archive of Teaching American History's Saturday webinar for Saturday, February 6, 2021. The focus of today's program was Ida B. Wells, pioneering investigative journalist and business owner. As always, our moderator was Dr. Chris Burkett of Ashland University, who was joined by panelists Dr. Davidkrugler of the University of Wisconsin-Platteville and Dr. Natalie Taylor of Skidmore College. Thanks again for listening.
Well, let's begin. So welcome everybody to another teachingamericanhistory.org Saturday webinar. These are sponsored by the Ashbrook Center at Ashland University. TAH.org is the leading online resource for the documents-based study of American history, government, and civics for teachers, students, and citizens. I'm Chris Burkett. I teach political science at Ashland University, also director of the Ashbrook Scholar Program for undergraduate students at Ashland University. And if you have any questions about that program, please feel free to contact me. This year, the theme of our webinars, at least this spring, I should say, is Remember the Ladies. If you're joining us for the first time, the point of these webinars is to bring together some thoughtful scholars to have an interesting, lively conversation about the particular person or topic. And we encourage all of you to participate in our conversation today by submitting questions via the Q&A function, not the chat function. That's an important distinction. The chat function is disabled, but if you have questions, please submit them via the Q&A function, and we will try to answer as many of those questions as possible. In the next week, you'll receive an email with a link by which you can request your certificate of participation, as well as a link to the archived video and audio from today's program. So today we're discussing Ida B. Wells, and very happy to introduce our panelists today. We have Dr. Natalie Taylor of Skidmore College and Dr. Davidkrugler of the University of Wisconsin-Platteville. So thank you both very much for joining us this morning. And looking forward to a great conversation where I learn a lot about Ida B. Wells. So let's just start with a broad question, and you know how this works. It's just sort of an informal, impromptu conversation. It can go any direction you want it to go. So you want to just start by talking a little bit about why should students, maybe even especially today, know Ida B. Wells? Why is it important that they know something about her and what she did? Natalie, do you want to start?
Sure, I'm happy to start. I want to thank everyone for joining us, and thank you, Chris, and for moderating our discussion. I'm glad to see David. I usually don't have the pleasure of seeing him in the cold months, but I'm glad to be here today. It's kind of funny, when I mentioned to my sister I was coming to talk with you all about Ida B. Wells, she said, "Oh, you could see she was struggling for words." I said, "You didn't know I knew anything about Ida B." And she's like, yeah, that's what I meant. And I explained to her that I have gotten to know Ida B. Wells through my interest in the suffrage movement and gender studies. I also contribute to the gender studies program here at Skidmore. And so I think she's just a fascinating woman who has documented certainly some really horrifying experiences of the freedmen during the Reconstruction and late Reconstruction of the South, and but also she documents some shifting attitudes about women, and also but she's not merely a historian. I think she gives us great reason to be thinking about the intersection, to use a contemporary term, between race and gender, and is very thoughtful on those matters. So those are some of my probably top 5 reasons for as a scholar of gender studies and also American political thought. But I know there are a lot more.
Yeah, a great answer to that question, Natalie. And it's just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, on why Ida B. Wells is so important. I come at her as a historian through my work on Black resistance to white mob violence. And one thing that has always struck me about Wells is that so much of what we associate with the modern civil rights movement boycotts, for example, or starting in the mid to late 1960s, armed self-defense, think Black Panthers. These are not new to that era. Ida B. Wells was an early advocate of armed self-defense, as one of the readings we selected today shows, and she was a strong proponent of and practitioner of economic boycotts to end racial segregation, discrimination, and violence. Add to that her prolific work as a journalist and her activity in the area of justice. In 1919, she was a key figure in helping save wrongly condemned and convicted sharecroppers from execution in Arkansas. So that's just a little bit more of why we should study her.
That's great. These are great introductions to get to know who she is and what she was about. So I'm going to turn to our first question. I'm not sure if you can all see this yet. This is from Heath. Let me see if I can do this correctly. Can you? I don't know if you can see the question now. Heath asks, what effects do we know? What effects of being emancipated, right? Having been born into slavery and emancipated. I know she was very young when that happened, right? But what effect did that have on her personally in terms of what she was trying to do and what she was able to do as an adult?
David, if you don't mind, I might, start by saying that as, she was very young. She was born just prior to the Emancipation Proclamation. And so her experiences with slavery might have been limited, but her parents' experience of slavery, I think, had a really profound effect on her future opportunities, particularly as I recall, her father was educated in a trade. I think it was carpentry. And so he had a kind of skill set that allowed him to, move into the workforce maybe more easily than other freedmen. And so as a consequence of that, he had a sense of independence, economic independence that, he was able to take with his family, and that, allowed him to educate his children. Ida B. Wells's education was cut short by some other family circumstances, but she did, become more educated than many of her generation. And so that allowed her to move into teaching school when the economic circumstances became dire after her parents were, they were killed by yellow fever, I think, in 1878 or about that time. Yep. So I do think that the experience of slavery had a consequence and an important influence on the shape of her life, but it maybe is one that was a little bit idiosyncratic. And so as a consequence, she was able to thrive in ways that other freed slaves weren't able to.
Yeah, thank you, Natalie. I would just add to that at the age of 16, upon her parents' death in a yellow fever epidemic, she became responsible for raising her younger siblings while working as a school teacher. So here she is, by our standards today, still a child, carrying enormous adult responsibilities. Mm-hmm. And those would be enormous if she had been white, if her family was white. The fact that they were African American in the Reconstruction period added to the burdens and certainly to the hazards the family faced.
So she was young. I didn't realize that. She was very young when her parents died. And I was fascinated to learn that she was actually emancipated by the Emancipation Proclamation, right? So she was, what state was she? Just a factual matter. She was what part of the South?
Mississippi.
So far, so deep South. So she, territory still occupied by rebels, according to the language of the Emancipation. Okay. Or by Confederate. Well, Lincoln called them rebels, right? So, so in the deep South, like Mississippi, it's even more remarkable that she had the opportunities that she had And that her father, as you were saying, because of his skill, was able to, have a little bit easier time of supporting the family after the war, after emancipation, and so on and so forth. But still, had to have been great challenges in that part of the country to just for her to get an education. So, can we talk a little bit about how she had the opportunity to get an education and what her education consisted of, even though it was limited, I think, as you said, Natalie?
Yeah, it was limited and it was certainly segregated already. The schools would have been segregated. And I don't actually know too much more beyond that she had attended the segregated schools of the South.
Okay.
I think, looking at her life's work, it's her self-education that really stands out. The reading she undertakes on her own. If we think about, some of these publications from the late 1880s and in her activism in the mid 1880s, she's still very young. She's just in her 20s when she's doing that. And, formal education, the opportunities for that are limited after she has all these family responsibilities. But like so many freedmen and women, she finds a way to educate herself.
Yeah, so she's reading on her. It's fascinating how many great minds and important figures were self-educated, right? So do we know, just curious, do we know, if not, it's okay, do we know what sorts of things she was reading? Who was she reading? What was she reading that may have had an impact on her? Do we know?
I don't know, actually. So I can't think of specific authors that she was reading as she turned to journalism. That's a good question, though.
Yeah, I'm just curious. Because I read the readings that you recommended for today, and she has you can tell it's not, I don't mean this to sound, like an insult or anything, but you can tell it's not as erudite, if you will, as somebody who, majored in English in college. There's a kind of,
Right.
there's a kind of earthiness to the way she writes, which I really appreciate in a way. And maybe that was helpful to her in some ways in getting her point across to, people who could just sort of, in a very basic, down to earth way, understand what she was trying to say. So.
Yeah, I might point out, by way of contrast, her writing style to one of her contemporaries, Anna Julia Cooper, who was also from the South, but she had, a much more impressive, and certainly even by today's standards, educational pedigree. She went to the right colleges in the North, and so her explanations of some of the same phenomenon that I think Wells is dealing with is much different. But as you're suggesting, Chris, it can be a little hard to follow. You got to read those lines over a couple times to get the same message, and to sort of because it is such a refined style, I think, in many instances. So for the teachers who are thinking about how they may want to incorporate either Wells or Cooper into their lessons, I think they're both, phenomenal women and writers, but they do have different styles, and the arguments are built a little differently. So, there's room for them all on the syllabus. I know, even on a short, 15-week semester or whatever we have to work with.
Yeah, because I was struck at reading some of these, the readings that were recommended with there's a directness, there's a kind of grittiness, and even when she's dealing with questions of, accusations of rape and things like this, the way she just presents these facts, they're kind of right in your face, and there's no this sort of refined attempt to, soften it somehow for particular tastes. And so,
Right.
and I just again wondered if that wasn't a result of the kind of upbringing that she had, the kinds of experiences that she had in dealing with, the harshness of life in some ways. So thank you very much. So we have a number of good.
Oh, Chris, might I just follow up on that point?
Yes, please.
With maybe a reference to one of the readings. So I had suggested maybe that we look at that early reading, the mission of womanhood, and that's early in her writing career. It's in 1888. And I think, it makes a nice contrast to some of the more adamant, clear, untarnished account of women's lives that we get at the end of her life. And I think that that had a lot to do with her experience in the 1880s and the shift that we see that's going on with how, as Reconstruction is coming to an end, and we're starting to see that there's shifting attitudes about African Americans. We're also starting to see that there's a shift in the way that women are perceived. So one of the instances that I think was so influential to her thinking about being Black and being a woman was an experience she had at a relatively young age when she was traveling as a teacher throughout the 1880s. Rail travel was becoming much more common, and there was regional services between Memphis, where she had gone to live and start teaching, and her hometown in Mississippi. And so she would often travel between Memphis and Holly Springs, her home. And she would travel in what was referred to as the ladies' car. It was much more comfortable, cleaner, and it meant to cater to kind of the sensibilities that we saw in the that she writes about in that early piece on the model woman. And she'd been doing it for a few years, and then I think it was probably about 1882, she was asked to leave. When she gave the conductor her ticket, the conductor asked her to leave the car and go to what they refer to as the second class or smoker car. It didn't have any of the refinements that the ladies' car would have. It was dirty, it was full of smoke and everything else. And the exchange starts off, relatively polite. And by Wells's account, the conductor said that he would treat her like a lady. And she replied, well, if you're going to treat me like a lady, you'll leave me alone. And so it escalates, and it ends with, 3 men hauling her off of the train. And so, so I think this understanding of a refined womanhood is really running counter to her experience as an African American, and that she had been able to sort of harbor these notions of the model woman until she realizes that African American women are just no longer going to be treated like that. And so I think part of that experience really informs how she has to sort of change her writing, changing her message, and even maybe changing her comportment.
Fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, that's such great background and analysis, Natalie. Thank you. I would just like to add a couple comments about that. I mean, you mentioned earlier intersectionality, and we do see that in this model woman essay. So in the first few paragraphs, it sounds very much like the middle class white Christian piety of the era. But then there's a subtle but significant shift in which Wells states that for the sake of noble womanhood for African Americans, there is a stigma that has been placed upon us, and that is that we are naturally or predisposed to lasciviousness and sexual, highly sexualized behavior. And this is a burden we have to overcome. We have to prove it wrong. And so she's suggesting that for African American women, there's this added responsibility that white women don't have. And you can see that as a sort of setup for her frankness in discussing interracial sexual relations in the longer essay we assigned on Southern lynching, in which she provides example after example of consensual relations between white women and Black men that were initiated by white women. And so you have this suggestion, well, why are we branded as lascivious or sexual? The facts show something very different. I mean, I'm not saying she's generalizing about white women, but she's saying, we bear this stigma, and it is not borne out by reality or facts.
Mhm, mhm.
Great points.
Yeah,
Really.
so interesting.
I'll just add quickly, since we had this question, and it may be one others have. I sent Chris Burkett the link for the meeting, and so Zoom registered him as my twin. So,
Of course, I can see the resemblance.
yeah. Well, we both have glasses on, so I'll have to spend the rest of the time figuring out who is who.
No,
But this is the real Davidkrugler speaking right now.
Yeah. It's an honor for me and an insult for you, David. I'm sorry.
No.
So
it's
we
an
have
honor for both of us.
We have a number of great questions then, and one of them was that question. So I'm glad you answered that, David. So Alia wants to know, could you tell us more about her being an educator? You mentioned she taught. What did she teach? For how long? Can we talk a little bit about her career as an educator?
Yeah, I can say a little bit about it. She started off teaching in Mississippi, and and usually at a distance. I mentioned that rail car had become, traveling by rail became more common. She initially began riding a donkey to her school to teach. And it really was a kind of strain on her. I mean, it was very, exhausting, because she, not just the donkey part, although you can imagine, because it was at a distance, it was often too far away for her to return back to her home where, her siblings were waiting. And so she needed to sort of constantly manage the care of her siblings and who was going to be there in her absence and that kind of thing. And then she started to go to Memphis, and David may know more about that decision. My impression is that it was just, better opportunities for her to teach there. And then as she was teaching in Memphis, she, she's a young woman, as we've already mentioned. And so she has a somewhat vibrant social life. I mean, I think if you pick up some biographies or even her journals from those, from that time, it almost feels contemporary, right? And, that I think that points to some of the sort of challenges that she may have had, walking this very fine, narrow line that David had described. But then it also gave her some opportunities when she was in Memphis to start writing for various newspapers.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the biggest reason for the move to Memphis, and this is often overlooked, but we need to acknowledge that Wells was also an entrepreneur. So we talk of her as a journalist, but it's important to understand that the establishment of the free speech, her publication in Memphis, required an outlay of capital, and she lost all that for her writings and had to flee the city. So, she's got this startup business, and, the cost of a printing press and maintaining an office, they're substantial. And that's all lost because of the backlash against her journalism.
That's a great point. And that actually reminded me of a question, which I just posted here from Kyle. First off, let's see, what does he say? Again, Ida B. Wells is tireless in her activism. That's what she's mainly remembered for, her anti-lynching activism. And although that was a passion and a focus, do you think that sells her short by missing out on the range of other issues that she took on, or I would add other things that she did? So when David was pointing out her entrepreneurship, I think that's an interesting thing, though it's connected to her cause. It shows the depth and the sort of range of things that she had to do to be successful in the things that she took on.
She also raised money for the defendants I mentioned earlier, the Arkansas sharecroppers. She traveled in disguise to Phillips County, Arkansas in 1919 to go to the to the prison where they were being held pending their execution. And I do want to note that these men were tortured horribly, dragged to court in chains, convicted in mere minutes, one after the other, with incompetent defense counsel, and immediately sentenced to death. And their lives were only saved years later, and Wells played a crucial point in that. So she takes tremendous risk to go down there, because had she been discovered, she may well have been lynched herself. The hostility toward African Americans in the wake of the racial massacre against African Americans in Phillips County, Arkansas, in 1919 was tremendous, and this in a year already noted for tremendous violence against African Americans. And then she set up a legal defense fund following a publication to expose the facts of what had happened. It actually created tension between her and the NAACP, which was also raising funds and didn't want there to be competing fundraising going on. But this is another part of her multifaceted life, traveling to meet with these individuals, encourage them to not give up, and then raise money to help pay for their defense. And while the NAACP gets due credit for sponsoring the legal suits that eventually saved these men's lives, a lot of that has to do with Wells's early intervention.
Well, that's fascinating. So she is she still in, where's she at this time? She's still in Memphis at this time?
She's in Chicago.
She's in Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
So she is taking part in these things like the sharecropping, the trial of the sharecroppers in other parts of the country. How does that work? Is she getting letters? She's got a network of friends that she's built up at this point? You mentioned the legal fund that she had set up, David. What's the organization of this like? I mean, to what extent is she an organizer of some sort of official network that's out there looking for things like this for her to become involved?
She had an establishment in Chicago. So she had founded her own organization in Chicago, and she also used that to support wrongfully charged African Americans who had defended themselves during Chicago's anti-Black violence in the summer of 1919. So she had, and forgive me, the formal name of her organization escapes me, but she had that already established in Chicago.
Fascinating. Well, this is all really good stuff. I'm just going to keep reading these great questions, if you don't mind, and hopefully you can say something about them. Some of them are a little bit specific. So Trip asks, did she have much communication or relationship with Mary Church Terrell in terms of advancing early rights? Natalie, you're shaking your head. Yes, you know something about this.
Yeah, well, and I probably know about a fraction of the kind of connection she would have had to her, and David can probably fill out some more of her relationship, but and that follows really nicely, I think, from your just previous point, Chris. One of the things that the Anti-Lynching Campaign did for Wells, and I think specifically for the suffrage movement, which is, kind of my sort of way that I come to her, is that it really laid the foundations, I think, for establishing an independent African-American women's rights movement. And so David had mentioned that she had to flee Memphis really because of her writings, particularly on her anti-lynching writings. And so she made her way to New York, where she first started to get involved with some of these other Northern African-American leaders. And so they were able to organize a sort of fundraiser for her once she arrived there in Brooklyn. And then what happened was that moved naturally into establishing an organization for her, or club, the Women's Loyal League, and then Boston followed suit with some sympathizers there. They organized another club or an organization for her. She goes home she finds herself eventually in Chicago a year or so later, and she establishes her own organization there. And so and this is sort of what's happening throughout. And so eventually these individual discrete, local organizations are going to culminate and then they'll become the National Association of Colored Women. And so that would be the sort of formal connection.
I never made that connection. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great.
So, I'll just say that this is going on with white women too, that they, so sometimes Ida B. Wells is sort of discussed or identified as what, scholars of suffrage refer to as the new woman, right? They're younger, they're not your Susan B. Anthony types. They are, better educated, they're often wealthier. And so they've got their own clubs. The white women have their garden clubs and their reading clubs. And they get the idea like, well, here we are, we're sitting here talking about Dante. And as one woman said, Dante's been, dead for 500 years. We can get back to him. Let's work towards suffrage. And so they start to do these in these kind of private associations. It gives them a kind of practice of organizing. And, then they're all able to link up. It's segregated, but certainly I think Wells is, and particularly is moving from the anti-lynching work, is able to really affect some important change in that regard as well, to add to our list of many talents.
And that's fascinating. Thank you. That's a great, good stuff to think about. So Richard asks, what relationship did she have, if any, with Marcus Garvey and the Harlemites? Was there a relationship there?
I don't think she had a close relationship with Marcus Garvey and the Harlemites. At this time, she's based in Chicago, and the Garveyite movement is present in Chicago. But by this time, she's involved with the women's movement, as Natalie noted, and founding her own organization, as mentioned earlier. But I think more broadly, when you look at some of the core messaging of Garvey and the Garveyite movement, self-help, Black nationalism, armed self-defense against white mob violence, there's where we see a lot of congruence between Wells and Garvey and the UNIA.
Oh, that's interesting. There's another question that is on that point, if you don't mind me trying to find it. This is from Fred. Do you believe her endorsement of armed opposition was more a result of her frustration at ongoing Southern resistance to Reconstruction, or was she truly a sort of precursor to a Malcolm X type philosophy? So I guess maybe Fred's asking, what led her to develop this sort of general attitude about the need for armed resistance, and some of the maybe other ways in which she leaned a little bit toward that Garveyite way of thinking.
Well, if I may, I'll offer an initial thought. I think that the key part of the answer here lies in Chapter 6 of Southern Horrors, Lynch Law, in all of its phases. And there's a passage. It's on page 80 of the packet, and I'll read briefly from it. Wells writes, "Of the many human outrages of the present year, the only case where the proposed lynching did not occur was where the men armed themselves in Jacksonville, Florida, and Paducah, Kentucky, and prevented it. The only times an African American who was assaulted got away has been when he had a gun and used it in self-defense. The lesson this teaches, and which every Afro-American should ponder well, is that a Winchester rifle should have a place of honor in every Black home, and it should be used for that protection which the law refuses to give." So that last phrase is especially important. You need this gun because the law doesn't protect you. And elsewhere in that work, in that text, Wells documents beyond doubt the avid participation of law enforcement in lynchings. So not only are they committing crimes against us, but if they're not a part of it, they won't prevent it from happening. This is a very clear message that this is necessary, but it's not a call for revolution. And I think to come back to Fred's question and the connection to Malcolm X, when Malcolm X is read carefully and closely, you can see that he's not calling for wanton violence. He's saying, if someone comes after you, you have to do what's necessary to protect yourself. So that's where we would see in alignment, and to also, I guess I lost the question from the Q&A, but if I recall it correctly, was this in response to the violence of Southern Reconstruction? And I would say yes, but more broadly, it's just a response to the intensifying violence, especially in the post-Reconstruction period. And it's difficult to read some of the details in this work, Southern Horrors, because that is not a word that is hyperbolic. It is really horrific, the violence done. Just the mention of people being burned alive. So, that's the response. I mean, just seeing the horrific loss of life and for what cause.
That's a great point. And then Angela asked sort of a follow-up. I think you may already have answered this, David. Is it similar to Malcolm X's "by any means necessary"? And that may be a different question in a way, because Malcolm X, as you were saying, you read him carefully, he really is justifying the right of self-defense. Interestingly enough, he's invoking a sort of fundamental natural right, almost, right? That's implied in the principles of the American founding. But he also does set up that idea of a separate community for Black Americans with their own economic network. They're helping each other, almost as a nation within a nation. I don't want to take it too far. And is that something that we can find in Ida Wells's thought as well?
I think, yeah, Chris, thanks. I mean, if you don't mind, Natalie, I'll briefly address that.
No, not at all, please.
In the essay, How Enfranchisement Stops Lynchings, we have two really important messages from Ida B. Wells, both of which speak to this question. So at one point she says, for a long time, for the last 30 years, African Americans have done the best they can. They've been advised to give up trying to vote, to mind their own business, acquire property, educate their children, go along to get along. Note how this is a reference to Booker T. Washington and his so-called accommodationist strategy. Now, that's another debate about how much of an accommodationist Washington was, but he was often knocked by other Black leaders for being too passive, too willing to accept horrific violence and structural discrimination. What is the solution? Wells says, and here's where we see a distinction with Malcolm X. She says further, with no sacredness of the ballot, there can be no sacredness of human life itself. For if the strong can take the weak man's ballot when it suits his purpose to do so, he will take his life also. So here's where we see the fusion of women's suffrage, the restoration of Black male franchise, full restoration of due constitutional rights, integration into the system as free and equal citizens and individuals. Now you jump forward, and it's important to keep in mind we are jumping forward when we go from the early 20th century to the 1960s. But in a key passage in The Ballot or the Bullet, Malcolm X says, "Look, are we living in a democracy? You have a supermajority of Democrats in the House and the Senate, and you have a Democrat in the White House who says he's committed to civil rights. Well, where are they? They're just not happening." And then he, devastatingly breaks down the failure of democracy, small d, in the country. You have the majority of residents in Mississippi can't vote. Same in South Carolina. That's just not democracy, he says. And the longer we wait for it to fix itself, the more we will be fooled. There's the difference with Ida B. Wells, who is not quite at that point.
Well, that's really interesting. I'm sorry, Natalie, were you going to jump in?
Well, I guess I had a few thoughts in listening to David, but they're kind of footnotes to that, or little add-ons. So I don't want to interrupt you, Chris, if you want to.
No, please go ahead. I'd love to hear the footnotes. Sometimes you find the nuggets, the real nuggets in the footnotes, right? So.
well, these may simply be, sort of this struck me as interesting too, category. So don't oversell it, Chris. so I was really struck by the difference between the piece that David just read from, how the enfranchisement stops lynchings does really, offer I think a nearly explicit, even if she doesn't identify Washington, a debate with Washington on the right means to bring about reform. And it's interesting, it's one that kind of always persists. I mean, we're talking about with Malcolm X, but even today, as we think about political change, we think about Washington really sort of saw that kind of economic independence and influence would bring about change, whereas Wells is making the case for the ballot. And so they're in some ways a kind of, a good complement to each other, even as they're debating. The other thing that I think is so interesting that David pointed out was the importance of the ballot for Wells, and how that is taking on new meaning as she becomes not just for the sake of African-American men, but African-American women. And so African-American women's activism, as we've been talking a little bit about, is gaining momentum just at this last stage of Black men's disenfranchisement. And so there's a way in, which is a little bit paradoxical, I guess, but so there's a way in which the suffrage of African-American women is certainly important to themselves, but it becomes important to their race. And again, this is another example of what David had really beautifully described earlier with respect to their sexual character, that now their political character takes on a kind of added responsibility for their entire race, because they will have to then be responsible or take some take some effort to try to improve the plight of African-American men, particularly Black Southern men.
Yeah, that's very thoughtful. Thank you. That's a lot to think about there. That was really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So, and as the more both of you speak, the more great questions come in response to things that you bring up. So I'm sorry if I keep jumping all over the place here, but clearly you're inspiring some good questions. And so maybe most immediately on what we've been talking about, Heath asks, since we've been talking about, we've mentioned Malcolm X several times. Do we know of any documented instances where Malcolm X takes inspiration from her in her civil rights, in his civil rights arguments?
I can't think of any specific references in his autobiography written with Alex Haley. I can't think of any like if he specifically references it. But it would be interesting to know if he had read some of her work.
Mm-hmm. Something to look into, perhaps.
It sounds like a capstone project to me.
Yeah. And then on the points you were just raising as well, Natalie, there are a number of questions, a couple of questions about her relationships with Frederick Douglass and other leaders of male leaders of the civil rights movement. Let's see if I can find these questions. So, for example, Christine, I'm going to send this question over to you. Now I have to find it. Sorry. I'm not very good with technology. I'll just admit that publicly. Where was that? Oh, my goodness, I lost it. I think I sent the wrong question over. Oh, Christine, if I recall correctly, she traveled to Britain. Can you discuss the effects these travels had on her and her work, as well as the impact of her travels on her campaigns for women's suffrage and equality? And this was the question I was thinking of. It seems she had a complicated relationship with Frederick Douglass as well, at least according to Paula Giddings in her biography, right, of Wells. Relationship with other leaders, Fred Douglass included.
Yeah, so she did get an opportunity to meet Douglass, and for a few short years, he was a really very important influence on her. I think I I don't think it goes so far to say that they not only had, the obvious collaborations, but also a personal relationship. Douglas remarried, as many of you may know, later in life, and he married a white woman, which, drew some criticism from African Americans. And Wells didn't take issue with it, so I think that, she made some friendly gestures towards her wife, his new wife, and as a consequence, I think Douglas appreciated that, and so they had maybe more of a personal relationship than maybe is often recognized. That's not to say that they didn't have their difference of opinion. They certainly were both smart, ambitious, and strong-willed people. And so I think maybe one of the most well-known disagreements might have come around the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893. The World's Fair was, a real happening. Kind of what I know about it, I know from another thread of my research. And so, as I understand it, African Americans were mostly excluded from it, and despite efforts of women in Chicago. And at this point, Wells hadn't settled in Chicago. She had, this is all kind of collapsing, so I'm sorry, Dave will probably have to help me tease it out. She had been in Great Britain traveling as the questions had suggested, and then made her way to Chicago in time for the World's Fair. So she really wasn't part of that lead up to the World's Fair. But, African American women and African Americans generally are trying to find a way to be represented at the World's Fair. And they were just, excluded. There were even very few jobs available for them. And so by the time she comes on the scene there, and Douglas is, obviously as the leader of recognized leader among African Americans at this moment, the question is what to do about it. They do co-author a pamphlet together, and I think that's probably really worth reading for a lot of reasons. But and they start to try to redress this problem, and they come up with an opportunity, a single day for African Americans to come to the fair. They sort of, give in to all the racial stereotypes and the exhibitions, and Wells wanted nothing to do with it. And Douglas was willing to suffer through these kinds of things for the sake of extending a larger message. And so I think she was really impressed with Douglas's capacity to handle that situation very elegantly and rhetorically in a way that I think gave her pause to rethink her, opposition to it initially. And maybe I don't know a ton about her time in Great Britain. She did leave, I think, to travel in Great Britain as a sense of, kind of frustration with her efforts in the United States. She just really wasn't, gaining the kind of influence that she had hoped. And fortunately, she had a better audience in Britain, and as a consequence, there was sort of external pressure to bring to bear on her anti-lynching campaign.
Thank you. Sorry, Dave. I didn't know if you were going to jump in.
Oh, I know. I just wanted to briefly point out, this would be a footnote, that her travels to Britain continue the tradition of Black abolitionists and those who had written so-called slave narratives, like Frederick Douglass, going on speaking tours and building support for abolition in the United States through support in Great Britain. So I kind of look at, her travel to Great Britain as a continuation of this, of course, in this case, to further women's suffrage.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think, did Du Bois do that as well? He traveled to Europe. I don't know if they went to Britain.
His travels were primarily for the Pan-African movement.
That's right.
In the pre-World War, the World War I era, basically, before and after as well.
Okay. Well, I think what both of you are pointing out here has been helpful, I think, to help answer a question that Kyle had submitted, where let's see if I can shift this over here. Now I have to find it again. Sorry. Oh goodness, I lost it. Kyle writes, movements are rarely, can you hear me okay?
Mhm.
Yes.
Movements are rarely perfectly united, and often leaders push the boundaries of what society finds appropriate or acceptable in order to force change. So how do you address Ida Wells' relationship with fellow activists and leaders at the time? We've been talking about Frederick Douglass, but what about the friction between W.E.B. Du Bois and David, I think you mentioned Washington, right? Booker T. Washington earlier. Did she get in the middle of that at all, publicly or privately?
I don't think she got in the middle of their disagreement publicly. It's interesting to know that Du Bois initially wrote a very laudatory letter to Booker T. Washington after he delivered that 1895 speech, but then later rethought his views. In terms of her relationship with Du Bois and the NAACP, of course, an organization she was closely involved with, I mean, it got so bad in 1919 that Walter White, who was the field secretary for the NAACP and who had traveled to many of the sites of anti-Black collective violence, including Arkansas. He had gone down there before Wells and passed as white because of his fair complexion and blue eyes, although he was identified and had to flee before he was targeted for a lynching. But at one point, he wrote an internal memorandum in the NAACP saying, and I mentioned this earlier, that Wells was raising money for defendants in Chicago, and the national office in New York of the NAACP was trying to do that. And at one point, Walter White wrote, "This woman is just nothing but trouble, and we have to figure out a way to sideline her." And I think that's really interesting for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, it does speak to this friction, but I think we also have to ask ourselves, was she seen as trouble? Was she causing trouble that was seen as unacceptable because it was a woman who was doing it? And I think that is a factor.
That's interesting. That's great. That's really interesting. So again, we have a number of great questions here. So I just want to keep going with these. Joshua mentions that Ida Wells was in Chicago during the 1990s. Does she write or comment on the Chicago race riot of 1919? David, I know you've written on this extensively, right? So,
it's really interesting. In all my research, I didn't come across any prominent writings from her about it. She did publish her investigation into the Arkansas race riot, and that's in the public domain, and the full text of that is available, and it makes for fascinating reading because it's not just an account of how these men were wrongfully convicted and tortured and being rushed to death. It also provides a substantial accounting of how these sharecroppers were cheated by their white landlords and how they had organized a union to get fair payments for the work they did, and that they were attacked for doing so, and that brought the racial massacre. So it's very much like her investigation into lynchings. She was an outstanding journalist who did her research and established the facts so that she couldn't be dismissed as being opinionated or a woman who's just got a shrill voice on the page, so to speak.
That's fascinating. And that reminds me, Cynthia asked, how do you think her in-your-face journalism would be received today in the U.S. or globally? I'm not sure if you want to answer that or not. It's a little bit theoretical, or hypothetical. But do we see something in her approach to writing and in her journalistic approach? Do we see the foundations of maybe some more modern approaches to journalism? I know it's a really broad question, but let me put it another way: is she a pioneer in journalism itself, leaving aside even the fact that she was African American and a woman? And maybe that's beyond the scope of what you want to address, but.
I would say, thinking about it as a historian and also, a citizen of this country in the present day, that as you just put it, Chris, very much a pioneer in this type of journalism, and I think to call it expose would severely disparage it, but investigative journalism, right? Like, here are things that are not getting reported. And they need to be shown. And in Southern Horrors, she's got this chapter. Let me just get the title correctly. It's about the white press. Yeah, the malicious and untruthful white press. So if we think about a variety of watchdog organizations we have, and nonprofit organizations that support long form, time-consuming journalism, the sort that newspapers used to carry out just as a matter of business, but no longer do, because obviously for newspapers today the model has changed. But I think Wells could be seen as a pioneer in that.
Okay, thank you.
I'll jump in on some of the conjectural. One of the, maybe tying back to some earlier discussions about the comparison between her and Malcolm X. I do think that what she writes about and the way that she writes about it and some of her principles, and as it sort of comes to have an activist component to it, does really resonate today, right? And it, maybe we could even tie this to another question regarding her relationship to the other African American leaders of her age, and in contrast to Washington, who's always generally sort of seen as accommodationist, maybe, or at least in hindsight. There is something, if we think about what the demands of leadership are, there is something that's at odds with this kind of activism, the sort of that prevents kind of leadership. So I think in some respects, David is for sure right that she did not emerge as a leader because of her gender when Frederick Douglass died in 1895. But in other ways, the kind of way in which she tried to bring about change precluded it as well. I mean, we know from our own age that it usually the activists don't get invited to the White House in the way that Washington did, for example. And so, we often think about them as being very different, but, I think one of the other questions that someone raised earlier was pointing out that they're kind of necessary. They have to sort of work in hand.
Yeah, great points. That helps clarify that quite a bit. Thank you. And then Janine asks, I think this is related, so a good time to throw this question out. Mm-hmm. Janine says, I read that she was often ridiculed, ostracized by some women in other women's suffrage organizations. So how similar were her ideals to other women's activists, the views of other female activists at the time?
Well, she did meet Susan B. Anthony in Chicago. So that moment when she arrives from Great Britain for the World's Fair in Chicago was important for a lot of reasons. Not only is that, she has this opportunity to collaborate with Douglass, but she also meets Susan B. Anthony. And I think that, she had a really fraught relationship with Susan B. Anthony she is also just on the cusp of getting married at this point. And then she will have 4 children. That's going to, mean that she's got to step back a little bit from the kind of work that she's been doing. And she was afraid to tell Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony had made it pretty clear to everyone that she, thought that having children and getting married was going to undermine the work on behalf of women's rights. And she wasn't wrong, certainly not at that moment. And sadly, Wells had to, do the work-life balance we all talk about today. And so those were, you know, and it was continued to be fraught, though. I mean, she was afraid to tell Anthony because she respected her. But then, you know, as the years went on and they continued to move towards women's suffrage, the National Organization of Women's Suffrage took what today we would simply dismiss as a racist strategy in bringing about a constitutional amendment. And it sort of, and Wells, I don't think she needed to chastise Anthony or scold her too explicitly. Anthony, you know, knew that this was, you know, a kind of failure of her earlier principles as she was, you know, coming to women's rights as part of the abolition movement. So yeah, you know, and so that's, you know, a description of one relationship, but I would, you know, maybe take this opportunity to say that the explicitly racist position or strategy of the organization, the suffrage organization, to pursue Southern, white Southern support for the 19th Amendment meant that they adopted a kind of an argument that white women, they would pursue women's suffrage with a literacy requirement. So that meant that they would be able to, you know, I guess technically allow for African-American women to vote, but because of the literacy requirement, I'm sorry, that would suppress the Black vote, and certainly. And so it was a strategy. It was morally bankrupt. It ended up not being an effective strategy. And so they did move away from it, but you know, it really was never a kind of integrated movement.
Thank you, Natalie. It's very interesting. And just maybe as a quick follow-up, Zachary asks if we know of any correspondence between Wells and other leaders of the women's rights movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Sojourner Truth. Do we know of any correspondence?
I don't actually. By this, I mean, I'm thinking about Elizabeth Cady Stanton. By this time, Elizabeth Cady Stanton is, you know, as bad as, you know, Susan B. Anthony might have behaved. I would say that Elizabeth Cady Stanton was, you know, just used uglier rhetoric, and I think was more strident. She didn't have the same, I think, political skills and understanding that Anthony had, and so as a consequence, I just don't know about the relationship, and I'm tempted to say because it was, you know, it just didn't have the same, you know, history to it for those reasons. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton was also moving out of the movement at this point, so kind of doing her own thing, writing the Bible, rewriting the Bible, and that kind of stuff.
There's actually, you know, the Ida B. Wells papers, which are at the University of Chicago, it's an extensive collection, but the correspondence that Wells saved is not a substantial part of it. So there's her correspondence with Frederick Douglass and with Mrs. Frederick Douglass, and also Albion Turget, who is famous for writing a novel about Reconstruction, letters to him and his wife, but not a lot of correspondence, at least on the Wells's side, with these other leaders. Now, if you go to the Mary Church Terrell papers, for example, in Washington, there may be letters on that side. I mean, that's the thing with correspondence, right? If one party saves it, it may not matter if it's not in the other party's collection.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. That's fascinating. So we have, about 6 or 7 minutes left. So before we maybe shift to our final big, there are a number of questions that have come in, I think, that are kind of asking the same thing, and I kind of wanted to hold them off to the end. And I'll get to that in just a second. But before we run out of time, I like to ask, do you have any suggestions for further reading? books that you recommend people pick up if they want to know more or read more about Ida Wells? Any recommendations for further reading?
Well, the Paula Giddings biography that was mentioned by someone in the Q&A is a very good one.
Okay, Paula Giddings, right? Okay.
Yeah. And sorry, go ahead, Natalie.
I was just going to recommend another biography, which I'm not sure is as strong as the one we've already mentioned. It's by Mia Bay. It reads quick, and it's particularly if you're interested on these questions of intersectionality that we've alluded to a few times. I think she's good on that.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. So here are there are a number of people who are kind of asking the big question in the end, in our last few minutes. So including Jen Jolly hi Jen, our old friend Jen. She asked this at the very beginning, so I've been holding this off for an hour. So the questions are a lot of questions along this lines. Would you consider Ida B. Wells' greatest historical impact to be her role in women's suffrage, in the anti-lynching movement, let's call it the movement toward justice, or for equal civil rights for African Americans? And Mitchell asked, what do you think she thought was more important to accomplish, right? Women's suffrage or civil rights? So there are a number of questions people asking this question. So what do you think was her most important contribution? What do you think she thought her most important role was?
If this were a multiple choice test, it would be D, all of the above.
Yeah.
I agree with David. I'm going with D. And I think the reason, and I think David and I have both, sort of given an indication of this, even though we come at it through different lines of research, it's really hard for either one of us, I think, to pull those things apart, right? We could measure the anti-lynching, her success with the anti-lynching, with the kinds of policy changes and so on that were affected, but they are tied so much to the ballot as she understood them, and I think rightly so, and those issues are so intertwined.
Okay.
And we see that, we see that in her writings, and we've, highlighted a couple passages, but for example, the one mentioned that without the ballot, you can't end racial violence. So, I think in her own mind, she did not separate them out in ways that seem obvious to us looking back on this history. I think in the moment, it just was all part of the same movement, the same effort.
Okay, great.
I had I just had like another little thought. I had a lovely conversation with actually an AU undergrad yesterday, Caitlin, about her senior project, and we were thinking a little bit about the way in which the 1960s women's liberation movement and identity politics that follows might inform or think make it difficult for us to understand someone like Ida B. Wells. Caitlin and I weren't talking about Ida B. Wells, but I think this is true of her too, that for us, we see sort of women's issues as being, very separate from, often in tension with, the politics that men might be concerned with and their use of power and so on. And I just don't think that Ida B. Wells had that same disposition towards men that maybe or what we today would call identity politics, in the way that, makes it sort of difficult for us to appreciate how these things are all wound together for her.
That's a great point. Yeah, very thoughtful. Well, we have 1 minute left. And I know you're both busy, but right after I said this is the last question, I think I got two interesting questions, which one of which may be a quick question. From Kyle, is there any theory about why we don't see surviving copies of her early newspaper editorials in the Memphis Free Speech? Do we know?
Well, her own archive, her own copies were destroyed because the office was looted. So, and then any copies that would have been out there, I mean, there's the issue of deterioration with the paper, and there just weren't a lot of copies. So I think that explains it. If I may, Chris, I think we've got this great question. From Casilla, what is a good way to connect Wells and writings to the BLM movement or just the current social and political climate? I mean, I think just a brief survey of her writings offers all sorts of connections to this. Her political activism. I think starting with Southern Horrors, lynching law in all its phases. I mean, there's so much there. We don't have time to get into all of it, but I would recommend that source as a way to make connections to today's movements.
Well, even that passage you looked at earlier, David, it seems so immediate and contemporary, right? I think, I know it's difficult to make generalizations about the BLM leadership, but there were some leaders who could have said those very words, right?
Yes, and I mean, I think especially in that work, Wells is recounting of how police are involved in the brutalities that police inflict. I mean, there's a direct connection.
Right.
Well, that's great. That's a great point that you're raising here at the end, and it leaves us with more things to think about. Right. So I was going to raise that question, and do I want to do that with 1 minute left or not? Because there's a lot more we can say about that. But thanks for tackling it, at least in the last minute or so. And again, thank you both very much for your time and your thoughts this morning. This has been very, very fun and informative, and I've enjoyed it very much. So thank you.
Yeah, me too. Thank you.
You're welcome, and thank you. This is, and to all the participants, thanks for such great questions and keeping us busy and engaged.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We love those great questions. So again, thanks everybody for joining us. Just a quick reminder again about the email that you'll receive with a link for your certificate of participation. If you enjoyed our webinar today and like this mode of having conversations about important historical ideas or figures, please take a look at the other resources that TAH.org provides, and help us spread the word about those resources, including our webinars, by sharing the archive link with your friends, your colleagues, post it on social media and other things. So our next webinar will be on Saturday, March 6th, and we'll be discussing Susan B. Anthony. There you go. So, and we'll be joined by Dr. Lauren Hall of Rochester Institute of Technology and Dr. Will Addo of the University of Dallas. So I look forward to seeing you all then. Until then, take care. Thanks very much.
You can learn more about our free programs, resources, and documents collections at teachingamericanhistory.org or TAH.org. Thanks again for listening.